going to do a bit of a revisit of the Poco X3 Pro. Now this is a phone that I've had for around 4 or 5 months now, and I've been using it on and off. In that time I've had my music stored on it, so I'm constantly going back and forth playing music on it. But I'm just going to go through how my experience with the Poco X3 Pro has been over the last 5 months, and I'll touch a little bit on the camera again as well. So if you're interested, stick around and let's get to it. So Xiaomi made a pretty considerable splash in the smartphone industry back in 2018 when they launched the Poco phone brand. And this started with the Poco Phone F1, which was a smartphone that boasted a really nice display, a respectable dual camera setup, and a then flagship Snapdragon 845 processor for less than 300 quid. And since then they've got better, they've developed, and they are still producing some really respectable phones at a very low price. So, of course, I had to try out one of these phones when I bought my X3 Pro. So 5 months ago, I splashed out £200 for my Poco X3 Pro, which when I bought it was about a month old, and it came as an upgraded version of the very popular Poco X3 NFC, and it improved in a couple of ways, mainly in performance. So what you get on the X3 Pro, instead of the Snapdragon 732G you found on the X3 NFC, you got given a Snapdragon 860, which was essentially a rejiggered and overclocked version of the Snapdragon 855 Plus, which powered the flagship phones from 2019. And this really boosted the performance to flagship grade for less than £200, which was just a bonkers thing that they were able to do. But an interesting move that they made was they actually downgraded some of the camera specs. Now this was probably because they put that more powerful processor inside. To keep the costs low, they probably then had to reduce the specs of the camera. So the main camera got downgraded to a 48 megapixel sensor instead of a 64 megapixel found on the X3 NFC. And the ultra-wide camera was downgraded from a 13 megapixel to an 8 megapixel as well. So there were a couple of compromises to fit that Snapdragon 860 processor inside. But personally for me, I'm not that bothered. A 48 megapixel main camera is still a high enough resolution for most people. And of course it still uses that pixel binning technology to produce brighter, more detailed photos in low light as well. But all of the other specs were the same. 6.67 inch full HD display with a 120Hz refresh rate, 6GB of RAM, but the base storage was boosted from 64GB to 128GB of base storage. But of course it's all expandable via micro SD, and the top configuration for the Poco X3 Pro was 8GB of RAM and 256GB of internal storage, which I think was about 50 quid more when they first released. The selfie camera resolution remained the same at 20 megapixels, the battery size was the same at 5160, both supporting 33 watt fast charging. So it was mainly the performance that had the boost, and then of course the slightly downgraded camera. You also had an upgrade to Gorilla Glass 6 protection on the screen as opposed to Gorilla Glass 5 on the X3 NFC, but even the Gorilla Glass 5 on the X3 NFC should provide a good amount of protection. And also one thing to note about the storage is it is upgraded to UFS 3.1 storage on the Poco X3 Pro as opposed to UFS 2.1 storage on the X3 NFC. So read and write speeds, if you're taking stuff off your phone onto your laptop and vice versa, should be a bit quicker. And also when you're opening things that you've got stored on your phone, such as maybe music or images or something like that, it should be read a little bit quicker on the X3 Pro. But in terms of the design and the aesthetics of the phone, it is exactly the same. So you've got this nice big Poco branding at the bottom of the phone with your quad camera setup in the middle. At the bottom you've got your headphone jack, speaker grill and USB-C charging port, which supports 33 watt fast charging. On the right you've got your power button with integrated fingerprint sensor and your volume rocker, and on the left is your SIM tray, which can house obviously a SIM card and a micro SD card. And then up the top you've got another microphone and an IR blaster, I believe, up the top as well. And then the second speaker for the stereo speaker setup is built into the earpiece as opposed to it actually being built into the frame of the phone itself. And the frame is still aluminium as it was on the X3 NFC as well. So still, in terms of how the phone looks, is exactly the same as the X3 NFC. and it still has quite a heft to it. It's 215 grams, so it's not the lightest phone in the world, but I didn't find it uncomfortable to use. The size is really good in my hands. I didn't have any issues with using the phone as a daily phone, as is apparent by me going back to it almost every other week and using it as my main phone, because I just love using this phone that much. People obviously comment on the adverts that are built into Xiaomi's UI, which they're still there, but they're not there that often, if that makes sense. You've still briefly got an ad that comes up whenever you download a new app on the phone, but then you just click open to open the app once it's downloaded, and then it goes away. Occasionally when I'm using the music app, an ad does come up that you then have to wait 5 seconds before you can skip it, but that's not every time I open the music app. It's probably 1 in 30, so it's not horrendous. So in terms of daily use of the Poco X3 Pro, I mean, this thing is just so smooth. Not a single stutter the entire time that I've used it. The 120Hz refresh rate is an adaptive refresh rate, so it will just obviously flip between 60 or 120 depending on what you're doing, but just the whole cruising through the interface is so smooth, so seamless. I've not had any issues whatsoever. Battery life has been great. I come home from a day's work and I've still got 60% battery left. I mean, the time now, day off from work, it's now 10 to 12. I took the phone off charge at 7:30 and I'm still on 83%. And I've used it for a bit of messaging, a bit of YouTube video, and a little bit of camera use as well. So the battery on this is really, really good. Oddly enough, it does have a slightly less of battery endurance rating according to GSM Arena, but that is probably going to be down to the fact that it uses that more power-hungry Snapdragon 860 as opposed to the 732 of the X3 NFC. With all that being said, the battery life is still great. You'll still get a day's use, no problem. If you're a light user, you may even go into a second day. So I've got no issues with the battery life. And then of course you've got that 33 watt fast charging. If you find that you are running a little bit low, this thing charges really quickly. Even though obviously there are phones on the market with 65 watt fast charging, I personally find that 33 watt is fast enough, absolutely. And it's obviously a lot quicker than the 15 or 20 watt fast charging on all of the Motorola phones that I've used as well. So I've got no issues with the battery or the charging on the Poco X3 Pro. And now in terms of the camera, this is where you will know that you're not getting a flagship grade smartphone aside from the very cheap price. The 48 megapixel main camera is respectable. It takes good photos in good light during the day. In low light, it does suffer, as like any other budget smartphone camera does. Night mode does help just to brighten it up and bring out a bit more detail in the photos. And the ultra wide camera again is the same, less detail, 8 megapixels, a smaller f2.2 aperture, so it's to be expected that the quality of the ultra wide camera is not really going to be particularly great. Although colour temperature is basically identical when switching between the main camera and the ultra wide, so you've got that benefit there. And then of course you've got your 2 megapixel macro and depth cameras. The depth camera of course will help to blur out the backgrounds in your portrait shots and to blur out the backgrounds if you're using portrait mode on an object as opposed to a person. And then the 2 megapixel macro camera is, to be expected. Very low resolution, but it can be a bit fun if you're taking pictures of a close-up of an insect or a plant or something like that, but you do obviously notice that there's the lack of detail in those photos. But in terms of the overall camera experience, I'm pretty happy with it. Video tops out at 4K, but I think you'll get the smoothest video recording at 1080p at 60 frames per second, but the video quality is pretty good. And finally, I just want to talk about the price of this phone now. So for those of you that have watched other videos on my channel, you'll know that I've covered a lot of Motorola smartphones. I'm a big fan of Motorola phones. Currently on Amazon, this phone is 185 quid. Now, the Motorola G30, which I've done multiple videos of, I'm a very big fan of that phone, I really do like it, is 160 at its normal price. Now, unless you're set on getting a phone with a stock Android experience like what the Motorola phones have, I don't see any reason why you would buy any of those Motorola phones and not buy this, because this thing just blows them all out of the water in terms of specs. Full HD plus display, which a lot of Motorola's don't have. They drop down to a 720p display. 5160 milliamp battery, which, okay, the Motorola's have 5000 milliamp batteries, but this has 33 watt fast charging. It has a 120 Hz refresh rate display. It has more RAM, and so a lot of the time more storage as on the base model as what those other Motorola phones have. So it's one of those things that if you're set on stock Android, then of course you're going to go to a Motorola phone. But if you're not, I don't see any reason why anyone would not want to buy this phone. And it still, in my books, should be classed as one of the best value for money smartphones that you can buy today. Not the best, but one of the best, because aside from the camera, which you do notice that you are getting a budget camera, everything else is pretty much flagship grade. Performance, screen, refresh rate, all of that. So like I said, if you're not stuck on stock Android and you want a good phone for a very, very good price, Poco X3 Pro. But let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think there are other budget phones that are better than the Poco X3 Pro? Of course, there's the Poco F3, which does improve on things again, like the Snapdragon 870. There's the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10 Pro, which again is a very good budget smartphone, but neither of those are as cheap as the X3 Pro. So let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.